Godzilla and Gamera are perhaps the most quintessential representation of Kaiju Eiga, especially for those in the Godzilla fandom. So it makes sense as to why this debate is so prominent. It's something that's been explored in multiple popular videos, with some of said popular videos being my very own, in which I found myself covering this topic multiple times, using different versions of the characters, with both instances being massive stomps. One of these times involved me using Rebirth Gamera and putting him up against Godzilla Earth, because for some strange reason I remember people on Twitter saying it would be a good fight. You know, these people are obviously entitled to their thoughts and opinions, but I mean, one guy blows up planet-destroying meteors, rips apart extra-dimensional deities, and destroys black holes, while the other blew up a small chunk in the moon and disintegrated afterwards. So it went about as well for Gamera as it could have been, to be honest. But another Godzilla property came out close to Rebirth's initial launch, and I'm of course talking about Godzilla -1, with this guy being much closer in stats to Rebirth Gamera, seeing as how after finally 6 months one can actually rewatch Godzilla -1 and all the clips are finally starting to make their way onto YouTube. I saw it fitting to put these guys in an old versus matchup. So my opinions as to these guys' overall scaling has changed. So if you see my older videos, you will find new things and better metas. But before that, once again, I'd like to thank you guys for the consistent viewership. And because of you guys' interest, I get to do what I love. And if you love the content, I implore you guys to hit the like button, as it helps boost the channel so we can find more people and grow as a bigger community. I gotta pass Godzilla guys somehow. So for this video, let's keep it chill. 1,500 likes and, you know, I'll call it a day. We've hit that milestone pretty consistently now, so I know we can do it. But with that out the way, let's put Godzilla -1 up against Rebirth Gamera. Okay, now that everything is out for Godzilla -1, I can give you guys perhaps the most in-depth explanation and breakdown for his capabilities and, you know, stuff like that of sort. So starting off with his attack potency, at the barest of minimum tier of power he would fall into, one would have to take into account his height and weight, as we need these values in order to establish his gravitational potential energy. Godzilla -1 has a confirmed height and weight of around 20,000 metric tons and around 50 meters in height, 50.1 actually. Plugging these values into the equation, and Godzilla -1's gravitational potential energy will be equivalent to around 1.181 tons of TNT, which is around building level plus. But once again, these are bare minimum estimates, so let's get into his actual statistics. And as you would imagine, a huge chunk of his scaling comes from his Ginza rampage, particularly a scene where he swings his tail and destroys a number of surrounding buildings, with the novelization stating that he turns these buildings to ash, taking that statement hyper literal, and one can assume he pulverized these buildings, which would mean that casual tail swipes would yield energy equivalent to around multi-city block in terms of power. I want to note that this level of power would scale to his durability, as he didn't really show any significant pain or damage after destroying these buildings. So yeah, that's around the highest he gets physically. So let's talk about his durability and how it's, well, kinda because as previously mentioned, at the peak he would be around multi-city block, but he can be staggered by attacks far weaker, as during his battle against the Japanese Tekado warship, he was staggered and a little overwhelmed by these cannons in rapid succession. Obviously, these cannons are not nearly as potent as his proposed durability, so it's apparent that you don't really need all that to kind of start to press him a little bit. And it's also important to note that this Godzilla's interior is far less durable than his exterior, as past Godzillas, you know, their cells can survive black holes, for example. But this guy is quite different, as a mine exploding in his mouth was enough to knock him out, as well as blow off a significant chunk of his face. And worst of all, his head gets blown off by some small building level explosion, all because the source of impact came from inside of his mouth. So yeah, his interior is not very durable. Godzilla largely makes up for this due to his very good regeneration. To give you an idea of how good it is, back when he was a dinosaur and much weaker and smaller, he was able to endure the Operation's Crossroads nuclear bomb test. This bomb generated around 21 kilotons, which is higher than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, as that bomb sat around 15 kilotons respectively. This is crazy because as a dinosaur, -1 Godzilla didn't really scale to the bomb at all. He was only like small building level. In fact, the novelization says that he would have been obliterated by the bomb if not for his regeneration. So that means that his regen could override blasts and attacks that far exceed his natural durability and attack potency, meaning that as a bigger, stronger, and now fully mutated Godzilla, his regen should be able to bring him back from attacks that far exceed his multi-city block physicality. Even getting his head blown up and then his atomic breath turning on him wasn't enough to permanently put him down, as though it would seem he's kind of regenerating as we speak, though we won't know how long it will take him to come back fully until -2 comes out, if it comes out. I'm sure it will come out, right? I'll just put it right up there next to Shin 2 and Godzilla Singular Point Season 2. But anyways, as it would seem, I've left out Godzilla's most powerful attribute, being speed, of course. Well, what did you guys think I was talking about? especially seeing as how Godzilla can react and move to planes that fly around 400 knots or 460 miles per hour. Assuming that this plane is flying at max speed during Godzilla when he encountered him, Godzilla being able to react in this way would grant him subsonic perception as well as subsonic plus combat speeds and reactions. Okay, I'll stop edging you guys with the atomic breath, and before we talk about calculations, there are multiple statements about the beam's power, as it's directly compared to a third atom bomb, and it's also stated to generate unimaginable power. Keep in mind this film takes place in the 40s still, if I'm correct, so unfortunately this would only include older model nuclear bombs, such as the ones in the kilotons. But this isn't really an issue because if we calculate the beam's potency, we can argue it to be much higher. Because according to the novel, the shockwave of the blast pulverized everything in a 6-kilometer radius. And it's because of that we found a calculation on the Versus Wiki that has asserted that the blast would have an output equivalent to around 17 megatons. Though Godzilla himself doesn't really scale to it, as once his head blown up and his atomic breath was forced to fire upon himself, he pretty much disintegrated. And even when he fires it regularly, it still hurts him. So overall, this guy's pretty stacked. He would be casually multi-city block level with subsonic plus reaction speeds, and his atomic breath would also be light speed, as I forgot to mention that it's stated to be a light multiple times in the novel, and it's also radioactive, which would kind of indicate that the beam itself is composed of radiation. Stack that on his almost instantaneous regeneration, and this guy is a force to be reckoned with. Rebirth Gamera, on the other hand, is just pretty odd to scale, as like -1, there's a lot of contradictory showings. But after rewatching all the fights and all the scenes, I think I have a pretty good grasp of how his abilities work and how his scaling is. So with that, let's talk about his main thing being his fireballs. As the AP, these things seem to drastically vary depending on the situations, but I think I've narrowed it down to 2 crucial aspects. One being how long he charges the fire, and 2 being how much fireballs he releases. So I'm suggesting that if Gamera charges for about 4 seconds, he has an option to either shoot multiple beams or one really powerful shot. This is very important because using this method, I was able to find a physical attack potency for Gamera. And it comes from this instance against Gaios, where he charges his fireballs for roughly 3 to 4 seconds in multiple instances. And for one of these times, he opts to shoot one powerful blast. And he misses, but we see that the yield creates a mushroom cloud and a particularly prominent shockwave to accompany it as well. But in an instance prior to where he charged it for roughly the same amount of time, he opted to fire 3 shots, and Gaios, who's physically weaker than Gamera, was able to endure one of these shots point blank. So since both of these attacks were charged up for roughly the same amount of time, with the only real difference being how Gamera chose to distribute the attack, we can take this one big one and divide it by 3 in order to estimate how powerful any one of the rapid fire shots were, in order to find Gaios and by extension Gamera's durability and attack potency. So how powerful or potent was this one right here? Alright, so thanks to some of my friends on Discord, that's a show to join the Discord by the way, link in the description. We can assert that this main blast is equivalent to around 54.4 tons of TNT, which is around city block level, dividing the value by 3, and one can assert that the Hyper Gaios can endure a blast equivalent to around 18.1 tons of TNT, which is city block level as well. Gamera is also displayed to be quite stronger than the Gaios in question, with Gamera pretty easily being able to overpower the Gaios every time that the confrontation is purely physical. But moving on to his fireballs once again, which are established to be able to fire in quick succession, with the ones that take 1 second to charge getting calculated to be in the large building ranges of power. And once again, these fire blasts can be quicked rapidly, and they're shot at speeds that far exceed his flight speed. We know this to be the case because typically Gamera will fire a ball before he heads into battle, and the fireball more times than not will actually beat him to the scene. This is even shown during his fight with Jiger, where he must have been charging the attack for a very prolonged period of time, as the blast that he shot here is actually one of the most powerful ones in the show, as the explosion of this blast creates a massive mushroom cloud. And when compared to old nuclear bomb testing, it's been asserted that the blast here would be equivalent to around 595 to even as high as 765 tons of TNT, which is multi-C block level plus. Though a much more conservative estimate of the blast yield bumps it down to around 340 to 425 tons of TNT, which is still around multi-C block. As for his abilities now, Gamera has plenty of things in his arsenal. For starters, he has a shockwave which was shown to drop Super Gaios, a kaiju who can relatively no-sell a barrage of Gamera's fireballs, so you know that this blast is quite powerful. Gamera also possesses a Scorching Hand ability, where he's able to transfer the attack potency of his fireballs right into his hand. For this instance here, Gamera showed the ability to harness approximately 4 to 5 seconds worth of power being charged right to his hand. Gamera then proceeded to shove his hand down Zyger's throat, igniting him from the inside. One could also argue this level of power scales to his own durability, as he could harness that concentrated power into his hand and not show any real injuries. Moving on to his flight now, where he can propel himself like a UFO and fly at stated speeds of around supersonic, though one could argue he's actually hypersonic, as he can fly out of the Earth's atmosphere, meaning that he can reach escape velocity, which would mean that Gamera can fly at speeds at least equivalent to around Mach 33, or 33 times faster than the speed of sound. While in this state, Gamera is also able to create a jet barrier where his enemies' moves will bounce off of the shell, but if he wants to go on the offensive, he has the ability to fully enter his shell and spin around at great speeds, essentially becoming a gigantic buzzsaw in the process, and this seems to be one of his most powerful moves, as it was shown to one-shot opponents that can no-sell his fireballs and even cut Gamera's limbs, meaning that this attack is possibly a one-shot's gap stronger than his base attack potency, which should be a difference of around 10 times. Alright, but finally moving on to Gamera's most notable attack, being his gigantic laser beam, and to be honest, I kind of hesitate to kind of even talk about this thing because it's barely combat applicable. As for starters, it takes too long to fire, and even if he gets lucky enough to get it off, it kills him shortly after. But everyone likes to talk about this feat because it shot through a chunk of the moon, a feat at a low end that gets calculated to around country level, with in my opinion more reasonable calculations getting this feat up to multi-continental. And the speed of the beam was at least sub-relativistic to even relativistic plus. So yeah, I think it goes without saying that if Gamera got this shot off, -1 Godzilla would be obliterated. But for all the reasons I just listed, it's kind of a long shot, and if he got lucky enough to get it off, he would die shortly after. But Gamera has a lot of stuff in his arsenal that doesn't kill him. So would this be enough to take on Godzilla? To be honest with you guys, this is one of the closest matchups I've had on the channel to date. In fact, I have this battle at almost around a 60-40 split. So there are ways that I could see either party winning, but simply I see Gamera winning more times than not. But as I said before, there are scenarios where both win, so let's talk about each side's win cons and what I think are more realistic. First of all, Gamera is way faster and versatile than -1 Godzilla, as he can produce large building level explosions in literally 1 second and then fire them in quick succession. I can see Gamera utilizing these attacks to drop -1 and then chip away at him with his claws and swipes. And yeah, I know, it's true that -1 with a casual tail swipe could potentially one-shot Gamera, as he was able to pulverize 5 entire buildings. But it's just blatantly apparent in the film that this doesn't scale to his striking force whatsoever, as we literally see him swipe away at the buildings in question and they're not pulverized. The tail swipe just seems to be a particularly powerful move in his arsenal. It doesn't really scale to his punches and such. But it arguably doesn't even matter because Gamera would probably never get hit with it because he's just much faster, as he can fight and physically land blows on kaiju who can react to his Mach 33 flight speed, while Godzilla was struggling to catch things that move at 460 miles per hour. Gamera has speed and reaction times that are around Mach 33, meaning that Gamera could replicate that speed 55 times over. And once again, his fireball spam is much faster than his flight speed. And yes, while it's true Gamera's more potent beams take prolonged periods of time to charge, granted it's only 4 to 5 seconds, Gamera has multiple ways to work around this, as he can easily create space between him and Godzilla via his superior speed and flight. So Gamera could just fly around Godzilla to charge up. But what I'm saying is that there are plenty of ways Gamera could, buy time to create a very potent beam. It only takes him 5 seconds to create a city block level explosion. And then he could shoot it 3 times in a row. So yeah, that's definitely gonna drop -1. Also, you guys remember how Godzilla's interior durability is trash? Well, Gamera can take this city block level AP and put it right into his hand, and then shove it into Godzilla's mouth. Such an attack would arguably blow off Godzilla's head. But I know what you're asking yourself now. What about Godzilla's regen? Well, Gamera could utilize his giant buzzsaw flying mode to chip apart out Godzilla -1, cutting every single piece apart of him for a very prolonged period of time. And yeah, I know Godzilla's regen was able to react to a nuclear bomb in real time, but nuclear explosions don't last for super long. So who's to say that you couldn't eventually tire out his regen from something that's likely more potent than his base stats for a pretty prolonged period of time? Also, I want to note that Godzilla's atomic breath would instantly kill Gamera. Yeah, that's true. But unfortunately, Godzilla's beam just takes too dang long to charge, with the shortest duration of the charge up that he used against Takato still taking around 10 whole seconds to fire. And this beam was also much weaker than the one that he fired in Ginza, so as this one gets around town level and the one he shoots in Ginza is around city level, so yeah. It doesn't help that the windup is also super duper obvious, and he gives him so much time that Gamera could easily just fly out the way. But as we see in the climax of the film, blunt force attacks can be used to change Godzilla's position and by proxy changing the direction of the beam. Gamera could easily spam a couple of fireballs or charge up a city block level fireball in half the time it would take -1 to shoot his quickest shot of the atomic breath, and seeing as how he's been dropped by far less, I think that it would be a pretty good counter to the beam. Now I think it's important to note that Gamera decided to block a laser beam in his show. So I've heard people say that Gamera would unironically just sit there like some spaz and wait for Godzilla to fire at him, because apparently Gamera is dumb and he would just sit there and try to block it. I don't see this happening because in the example that they point out, they use an enemy that Gamera already, had experience fighting. And there's also the fact that Gaios' beam was also much faster and had a far less prolonged period of time for the windup. It was so fast that Gamera had no real choice but to block it, whereas Godzilla -1's beam takes 10 to 20 seconds to charge up. But going back to this Gaios instance right here, while blocking said beam, he was charging up a pulse. So in fact, I would argue that it's in character for Gamera to attempt to drop his opponents when they try to beam him. But overall, yeah, as I've said before, this is around a 60-40 split, because Gamera realistically has the speed and abilities to put down Godzilla. I don't think you'd be able to kill him, I want to reiterate that, just because of his regeneration. But Gamera could easily beat him down, or just, leave him in such a critical state that it would take him a very prolonged period of time to get back. But I do think it's possible that Godzilla could win, because he does have the things to kill Gamera, but you'd have to say things like Gamera's dumb and stupid, and frankly, personally, I don't think that he is. Especially if we're going to compare him to Godzilla -1. Blood just sat there and let a plane fall into his mouth and didn't even try to take it out. Yet Gamera's a dumb one? Yeah, right. Sounds like cope to me. But today's winner is Gamera. So yeah, what did you guys think of this matchup? Was it about what you expected, or do you disagree, or were you surprised? Leave your contentions or thoughts in the comments. And while you're down there, be sure to comment the comment of the week being Turtle, for obvious reasons as well. It tells me that you watched to this point in the video and that you're a real one. The summer just started and I have a lot of video topics that I want to give you guys. So yeah, this is going to be a crazy summer and I hope that you're here for the ride. And if you're new here, be sure to subscribe. It's free and you can unsub anytime that you want. And as I said, I'm going to give you guys bangers this whole summer. But as always, I'll see you guys next week. But until then, stay big, G fans.